It's a pleasure for Vic and I to be here to talk about land and people. And we acknowledge the work of our co-authors, Drs. Al Jobson and Quintin Lau. So let's start out with a little trip. Imagine yourself away from this conference center. Imagine yourself away from Banff. Imagine yourself away from Canada and somewhere in prehistoric Africa. And think about yesterday and today. Did you forage for breakfast? Did you go hunting game for dinner last night? Did you warm yourself before the fire before you went to sleep? Did you keep that fire going all night to keep the wild animals away, particularly to keep the carnivores away from you? And did you survive the day? And now come back to Banff today, 2016. Did you have a buffet breakfast? Did you have dinner from a select menu at a nice restaurant downtown? Did you turn down your thermostat or turn up your thermostat, turn on the fan, open the window to keep your nice, safe room pleasant for sleeping? So we've come a long way. And that's what we want to talk about today, the land and the people. So we arrived here where we are at today because of what we were able to get from the land. And in so doing, we altered the land dramatically. And some believe that we altered the land so significantly that we have probably made our future unsustainable. Well, land and people is a rich and diverse topic. And when Vic and I first started digging into this topic, it just kept growing and growing. And obviously, we can't talk about all the aspects of land and people today, but we hope to give you a few things to think about, something that you can maybe move forward in your own sustainable land working career. Our talk is centered around a bit of history, first of all. Then we want to talk about what some of the drivers are to change. What would make us do things differently so that we can enhance the opportunity for sustainability? What are some of the challenges that we face? And what are some of the potential solutions? So land provides a huge number of goods and services. And we get things like energy, agricultural products, water, etc. And all of these components of the landscape interact, and they also interact with us and we with them. What we don't get from the natural environment, we require external energy. And so we need energy for light, to cook our food, for transportation, to develop raw materials that we're going to use in our everyday life. Now, over the millennia that we have interacted, we've made a lot of land use decisions to procure what we need for energy and to procure what we need for food. And those decisions have had consequences and they've had risks. And we haven't always thought about those consequences and risks. It was pretty easy to balance what we needed with the early environment, but it's a little more difficult today when we're not only looking at what we need to survive, but what we want to survive, what we want to sustain the lifestyle that we live today. And so by doing that, we're pushing the limits of the planet, which obviously requires us to address those risks and the outcomes of our decision. So let's take a little quick trip and look at the ancient connections of land and the people and see what we can learn from those historic evolutionary aspects. It took us about 15 million years to evolve from Australopithecus through to Homo erectus, through to Homo sapien, or modern day man. And during that 15 million year evolution, a lot of things happened. We developed amazing hunting and gathering skills. We developed a more nutrient-rich diet, a higher quality diet. There's some really interesting research right now on how adding meat to the diet and having a high quality diet early on in our evolution enhanced the opportunity for cranial capacity development. And in other words, we got bigger brains. With bigger brains, we were able to develop language. We were able to communicate better with each other. We developed social systems. We worked together. And all of this basically added up to the fact that we were living longer, mortality was reduced, and the population could increase substantially. Fire was a huge thing for early prehistoric man. Once we had the use control and we were able to initiate fire, we had power that was different than what we had at any other time in our history. And the combination of the tools that we had developed and the agriculture that we had developed really gave us the power to dominate the ecosystems that we occupied. And specifically, it gave us the opportunity and the ability to move those larger populations out of Africa, where we all started, into all parts of the world. We could now live in many more challenging environments and climates and landscapes because of the fire, the tools, and agriculture. And so if we look at this very quickly, we initially thought that there was an abrupt break between hunting and gathering societies and modern agriculture. But some of the more recent research shows that this was a much longer period of time, that we had this great transition period over which we were doing a bit of hunting and gathering, we were starting to domesticate plants and animals, and then we moved into the more modern agriculture that was focused specifically on domestication. And if you look at the origins of the world's food crops, I thought you might find this interesting, and you might be a little bit surprised to see how some of those tent centers are actually in South America and North America. The domestication of animals followed a similar pattern to what we did with crop development. And the spread of agriculture, if you look at the little gold circles, there were 7 major cores from which agriculture evolved and spread. And the really interesting thing about this is how it was evolving at different places at the same time. A little bit about that rich history of agriculture. So we moved through the millennia then from having early human tools, we modified, we refined those tools, we moved into a mechanized type of agriculture. We went through several advances, things like irrigation, use of fertilizer, building of the first anthroposols about 6,000 years ago. We had a few agricultural revolutions, industrial revolutions. We started using genetic engineering to get us the kind of plants and animals we didn't have naturally. And today, one of the things that we're addressing is that maybe after all, let's go back a little bit, because organic crops and livestock may be better for us and for the planet. We're looking at whether plant or animal protein is more appropriate for us as humans or for the planet as well. Now, the history of energy is pretty similar. A lot of advances, a lot of changes. If you look at the first 3 boxes before the Common Era, essentially what we were doing was addressing our energy needs by adding more sources of energy. So we went from fuel, basically wood, to animals, wind, and water energy. And then in the last 3 boxes, certainly after the 1700s, what we were doing was not adding new sources, but adding more concentrated sources. So by then, we pretty much ran out of wood. We were going to be adding oil, gas, and other types of fuel and electricity for energy sources. Now, I'm not going to read all this, and you can just pick out 1 or 2 in the next 2 slides of things that interest you. But we have an absolutely incredible, rich history of agriculture and energy in Canada. And just to point out a couple of really interesting things, you can read more details in the paper, but 11,000 BC, just at the end of the last ice age, we had horse and camel hunting in southern Alberta. And then we spent the next 500 generations and moved into the first trading post, the time of Pond and Henday, the first cattle herd that came into Alberta in 1871, all the way to the 1895 Homestead Act, which was pretty monumental for Alberta, because at that point in time we started breaking the land and developing agriculture as we know it today. Same with energy. Did you know that it was 1715 when we were first finding the oil sands? And there was a small development there. 1792 coal, and we can work our way through to natural gas. 1926 in the middle, Clark's hot water extraction for oil sands opened up the industrial activity there. And all the way to 1993 and the first commercial wind farm. So what does that really mean? In essence, if we're looking at lessons learned, and where we've been. When we had a very small population and we were occupying a small area of land and technology was pretty rudimentary, we didn't have a huge impact on the environment. But progress very quickly to where we are today with much larger populations, a whole lot of technology, we are having a pretty significant impact. Such a significant impact that humans are equivalent to geophysical forces, and many are calling the era we're living in the Anthropocene.
We're transitioning from the past to looking forward, where we're headed. What are the drivers of where we're headed in terms of land use, energy, agriculture, food? And of course, one of the key drivers is population. That's been a driver of energy demand, of agricultural demand, and of demand for resources in general. Now, lots of different questions about where we're headed with global population, but clearly the signals are that we'll continue to be increasing. Where are we going in Alberta is also, we start to focus a bit more towards where the trends are. Again, significant increases in the recent past. Are we going to continue along some of those trend lines? This is one of the big pushes for use of land and the use of materials from land. But the other big driver is income. And of course, this one is also challenging to try to forecast or predict. This is PricewaterhouseCoopers' newest long-term income projections. We see things that maybe aren't surprises. We see India and China as having very strong growth rates in income, but fairly positive and strong growth across the globe over a fairly long period of time. One of the pieces that's hidden a bit in here is income is a strong driver of demands for energy and resources and food, but there's increasing concern about the distribution of income and how those will affect variations in supply as well as demand of food products and energy products and such. So lurking behind the scenes, we have the distributional aspect or the equity aspect. We put a couple of these together, we get some interesting kinds of trends and projections. And this is just one of the scenarios that, as Ann and I were looking at the literature, a projection on caloric demands. But you can see on the left-hand side, total calorie demand increasing over time in some parts of the world, but fairly steady in North America and developed regions. Interestingly enough, this group actually was including in their forecast of food waste. And food waste is a substantial component of that caloric demand. We'll talk about that again a little bit later. But then we also see these income changes resulting in changes in taste and preference. So it's not only an aggregate increase, but changes in what people consume. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing animal-based protein increasing fairly significantly over the first half of that period, but then dropping back down again, a signal of changing global tastes and preferences and demand. So as these drivers start to manifest themselves, we'll see these composite effects of sometimes large increases, but also changes in the composition of what people want and what people need. So we've talked a little bit about where trends have been and where they've gone. And of course, we've benefited greatly from energy resources, from ecosystem services, from food products, from land, but that's also created challenges for us. So we're going to step through a series of what we view as some of these challenges, and then in the latter half, we'll talk a little bit about what some of the opportunities might be. And of course, one of the serious overriding concerns is climate change. Our use of fossil fuel resources has created a number of significant challenges around greenhouse gas emissions. We know many of the stories around changes in global temperature. This is going to affect agriculture, it's going to affect food, it's going to affect biodiversity, it'll affect water use, it'll affect the way that we deal with energy. What's going to happen in Alberta as we focus closer down to our part of the world? Well, these are some of Dave Sauchin's projections and some of his work. Largely increases in temperature and likely to be somewhat wetter, but the overriding issue is the variability of climate and weather in this province and in the prairies in general. One of the most variable climates on the planet will likely see more variability if nothing else, and that will be embedded within these trends. How well will we adapt to those trends and changes? That, I think, is part of how we deal with the challenges and the opportunities.
So one of the biggest challenges that we're working with then is related to food and energy and balancing how we're getting food and energy, how we're using the land. So energy and food are really interrelated, and they need each other, but they also compete with each other, which is one of the challenges. So it's pretty important that we look at what the trade-offs are depending on the land use that we're going to be looking for, like alternative land use, if we're going to be using land for biofuels instead of for food, for example. And it really makes it important to not only look at making the procurement of food and energy sustainable, but how do we control the adverse effects? And so remember earlier when we were a small population in a small area of the planet, that wasn't so important as it is today. Now, I live in Edmonton, and I often hear people make the comment, how do we build a city on the best Chernozemic soil in the country? And that's one of the challenges that we have. When we're looking at economic development, we're looking at the opportunity for the infrastructure that we require for the population that we're supporting today, we're often forgetting about some of the consequences, which means we now have a lot of good agricultural land not used for agricultural production. So look at the biofuel challenges. And there's a fair number of things there, but I want you to look at it visually. So we're in the scenario now where we are saying we must become independent of fossil fuels. We need to make a rapid transition into the use of biofuels. So if you look at the two columns, they're pretty almost equally distributed. If you're looking at the pros of fossil fuels, well, obviously we have existing technology and infrastructure. If you're looking at some of the cons, obviously they're not renewable. They produce CO2 and greenhouse gases, etc. But look at the biofuels as well, and look at some of the cons associated with biofuels. It would take a lot of building and time and money to create the infrastructure to become dependent solely on biofuels. Formaldehyde as an emission, particularly with the production of ethanol, is something we don't often think about. The other thing we're not looking at is the fact that we would require subsidies to switch over to biofuels, which fits into the economic alternatives that we're looking at. So what is the point that we're trying to make here is maybe one of the solutions is that we could blend the use of fossil fuels and biofuels. And we're going to have to do that anyway over at least the short term because we can't make that switch so quickly. Maybe biofuels are more sustainable only if they don't compete with food production. So we have a lot of questions to ask about land use and what kind of land we're going to be growing biofuels on. It's interesting in some of the circles that I have conversations with from a reclamation perspective is when we have land that it would take a lot of time, a lot of money to actually reclaim appropriately to equivalent capability, why don't we grow biofuels on that land? We don't have to reclaim to the status where we can produce food. And that's often met with, what? Industry's totally shirking their responsibilities. This is a stupid idea. Why would we even think of that? And so we're set very much in a current mindset, and we're not always looking at the consequences.
So another challenge, of course, globally that faces us is around water allocation, water distribution. I use this chart to remind ourselves that we're actually in a pretty good spot compared to many places in the world, that the rest of the world would view us in an envious fashion. And yet I think we recognize that things closer to home and in certain regions are not as good as perhaps we'd like them to be. Now, I'm old enough that I used to get still pictures in the cereal boxes that you could put together and turn into moving pictures. That's how we had instant replays of hockey players back in the old days. So I compiled this little set of slides from work from Alberta Environment and the water portal. These are the allocations of water compared to natural flows. And if you just watch the trajectory as we go from 1900 with the southern part of the province just starting to have some of those allocations, we step through. We can see the changes to 1960 to 1990. We're already starting to see some basins that allocations are larger than sustainable flows to 2000, 2006. And the very last year they changed the color scheme on me, so I couldn't quite do the step through. But what we see historically, this very interesting pattern, not surprising, with increases in food demand and population and in land use and associated climate change likely, where now we have basins that we are suffering some water scarcities. This is some of Monterey Farmarzi's work on the Predicting Alberta Water Futures project, where we see some of that is actually seasonal based in certain basins where we do have these critical shortages or critical conditions around water. And how are we going to respond to these challenges? How are we going to regulate? There still is one other element within water that I think many of us are puzzling over, and that's groundwater. And this is just a series of projections on water well densities, and not as much certainty perhaps as we have in other areas. but raises significant questions about our use of water resources and how we're going to regulate or control some of those challenges.
So now back to soil. The most serious threat to world food production is soil degradation and soil erosion. So when we think about it, the science shows that we are losing soil 10 to 40 times faster than what it's being produced. And this is mainly due to the intensity of land use and the continued intensification of that land use. So if you look at the chart and look at the dark green and the light green, in Africa and Asia, wind and water erosion are still some of the primary issues associated with soil degradation. When we move into the developed countries, into North America, for example, we're seeing that we're losing a whole lot less soil, either through erosion or other types of degradation, physical or chemical. But the bottom line is we're still losing a fair bit of soil. And one of the things we need to think about, particularly for developed countries, is the reason why the soil degradation is not being addressed. It's not that we don't know how. We know to keep stubble, we know to keep the ground covered, we have all sorts of techniques and science that has fed into the development of those techniques. But when you're a farmer who owns a small piece of land and you're pushing the limits of that land to make a living, to make enough food to feed your family, to make enough money, and sometimes that's why they get into the cash crops at the expense of foods, it really becomes a huge issue. And so until we start looking at poverty as one of the key links to social or to soil degradation and make it a social issue, not just a biophysical and a political issue, we're going to continue to have that type of degradation. But we've made giant strides, and what I want to illustrate with the next two slides is basically when we understand the problem and we make a conscientious effort to address that problem, we can have some pretty big impacts. So if you look at, this is from the United States, it's erosion on cropland from 1982 until 2010. And if you look at the data, you can see a steady decrease in the amount of erosion and soil degradation. And that's because of these types of techniques for more sustainable agriculture. And if you look at the data associated with a reduction in summer fallow, these are different years, but you get basically the idea. The trend line is pretty much the same. So with reduced summer fallow, one of the techniques that we're using, then you get less erosion.